a fellow of the American Institute of Architects at a very early age, 44, but never really grew into being a fellow in the sense that most fellows have an ego larger than life. So when researching someone, especially the life of someone, what you start with is a timeline. Hopefully you can all see this. There's a lot on this screen, and so it's not meant for you to be able to read the whole thing. But basically you start with a timeline. So you start with the death, or you start with the birth and end with the death. And then for individual years between those two dates, you fill in facts. I've kind of blown up a little section here to give you a sense of what that is. This is the year of 1907. Reginald Johnson was 25. He was completing his fourth year at Williams College and applying to MIT. And these are the facts for that year. So we figure out the facts, and then we verify and determine if they're factual or not. And hopefully we get first source documents like birth certificates, marriage certificates, death certificates, voter registration, telephone registries. In the case of school information, we get the student records from the registrar. So Reginald Johnson was born July 19th, 1882 in Westchester Township, New York. Now, if any of you are familiar with the Westchester area of New York, you'll realize there is no Westchester Township. Which, if you're trying to find early records to someone and their town doesn't exist anymore, that makes it pretty challenging. There is a Westchester County, and oftentimes we hear about Westchester County, but there's no Westchester Township. And that's because in 1895, the city of New York annexed the town of Westchester, and it became the Bronx. And so once you make that connection, then you can track the history down of the person's early days. The other thing is that in the, probably, I'm going to take a guess because I don't know for sure, it wasn't until probably the 20s or maybe even the 30s that births began to occur in hospitals on a regular basis. Before that, most babies were born at home or at a midwife's house, not a hospital. And so there's no birth certificate because the hospitals are the ones that generate birth certificates that then are filed with the local recorder's office. And so trying to track down and verify Reginald Johnson's birth and year and date is challenging. But once you realize that almost every home birth or a midwife birth was recorded in the local church directory. Well, Reginald Johnson's father was a reverend in the Episcopal Church, so he was born at the church. It's in the upper right corner here is St. Peter's. He was born there, and so we find his birth date and birth record in the records of St. Peter's. Now, you'll notice that I've got the same picture for the Reverend Joseph Johnson only because that's the only picture I can find of that man. And so you get to see his mug 3 times here eventually. So the adolescent years of Reginald Johnson were spent in Detroit. They moved from Westchester to Detroit, where his father became the pastor of Christ Church. And they spent almost 10 years shepherding that community. And so Reginald's teenage years, early teenage years, were spent in Detroit. His father was a very well-respected Episcopal pastor. He gained responsibility quickly in that order. He was considered for a post of bishop many times, but turned it down because he wanted to shepherd the flock and didn't want to go into management, as it were. But in the late 1880s, probably 1885 or 4, somewhere in that place, the Episcopal Church saw an opportunity to expand into California. They had yet to really have a presence in California, and so they needed a bishop. And at their annual conference, there were a number of candidates for the bishop of the LA diocese, brand new diocese, whose territory went from, or I think it currently does, from San Diego to San Luis Obispo. And Reginald Johnson won election as bishop overwhelmingly, and they moved to Pasadena. And Reginald Johnson was 13 at the time. So now we're in Pasadena. We see the bishop again. Now he is a bishop. Reginald Johnson's father, Joseph Johnson, wielded considerable influence most of Southern California, at least from San Diego to San Luis Obispo. And he could pretty much, ask for the church to do something because he was the bishop, he's the boss. They pretty much did it. So they lived a very comfortable life. The Episcopal order is a very wealthy church, and the bishop led a very comfortable life, and so did Reginald Johnson. You can probably get an impression from the photograph of the bishop that he was a stern man. He didn't take any bullshit from anybody. He was a no-nonsense kind of person, but very compassionate. Had no problem speaking his mind about any particular issue that happened to be facing the congregation or the community. And he was a firm believer in education. There are many private schools in the Los Angeles area, San Diego, San Luis Obispo, that are still operating today, that he helped to found. And we've got one right here, and it's Kate School in Carpinteria.
Hey, Robert, I think we are seeing a cropped version of your presentation on the screen.
All right, let's see. All right. So what do you see? Do you see the prep school football team of 1902?
Yeah, we just see the picture. Yeah, we don't.
Okay.
We
All right.
Is that all it is?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Then we're good.
So, yeah, I don't see that. Yeah. Rodney reports that he can't see it either. So, hold on a second. Let's do a not a reboot, but a reshare and see if it. Don't know if that's any better, but let's keep going. All right, so by 1902, Reginald Johnson was 18, and he's getting ready for college. But before college, his father sends him off for a couple of years at prep school. He was an avid sportsman. Here he is on the football team. There you go. All right, so I'm one behind you. All right, so here he is on the football team. As I said, he spent 2 years at a prep school before going to Williams College. His father graduated from Williams College, so I don't know what's going on here. I keep going backwards, and you guys keep going. Let me see. Oh. All right. I don't know what's going on with the television. I'll ignore it. How about that? All right. So he enters Williams College. He thoroughly enjoys his time at Williams College. He gets involved in everything. The college is divided into houses, and he joins the Gargoyle House or Society. He's on the football team. He's working on the yearbook. He's all over the place. Very well engaged in college life, probably encouraged by his father to do so. Here he is on the football team, third year at Williams College. Yeah, I don't know either. Stand by. Come over here, RB.
Okay. Oh, it's down to ITV.
Yeah.
Now.
I disconnected it.
Oh, I see.
All right. So, sorry for all these hiccups. So he gets ready for MIT. MIT, as most of you know, all of us know, is a very difficult school to get into and very challenging to remain a successful student. So when I got a hold of his records of MIT and a number of other support documents from their archives, the record is really spotty of his attendance. It's difficult to nail down. You might want to get a chair. It's difficult to nail down when he arrived, what he did, what his classes were, how involved he was at MIT. He shows up in odd years, and it was just a real challenge to figure out what was going on. And eventually I did. And it's because he initially enrolled just as a regular student. And then he shows up as, quote, special student, unquote. This is what threw everything into a question mark. The reason why he was able to enroll as a special student is because he had already a 4-year degree from Williams College. And so he could skip a lot of the first year. In fact, he skipped the entire first year at MIT because he already had a 4-year degree, and he joined his class of 1910 as they started their second year. And this gave him an additional year at home where he worked for Pasadena Architect. So here, just give you a sample of the kind of coursework that it took to get through 4 years of MIT School of Architecture. You can see here you've got freehand drawing, calculus, German, English literature, European history, calculus, composition, architectural history. And it wasn't really until the second half of your third year and your fourth year that you began getting all the drawing classes. And there are a few, kind of life classes tossed in there for good measure. A lot of these classes were taught by the well-known architects and engineers of their day. They would come in and lecture about a topic. So after all of this coursework, how you graduated was you produced a set of drawings through a thesis. This is Reginald Johnson's thesis drawing from 1910. His thesis was about a private museum. And of course, you wonder, a private museum that looks this grand for Southern California is not out of the question, because Reginald Johnson lived within a few blocks of the Huntington. And at the time, the Huntington wasn't a library, it was an estate to a railroad baron who had a museum on his property. Much, I don't think it looked like this one. This is a make-believe one, but nonetheless, a very grand building. So the thesis drawing tells the professors whether or not you've captured organization, watercoloring, line work, drawing, proportions, and programmatic spatial relationships. And if you successfully executed your drawings, then you passed the class and graduated. Here's what that building looks like in elevation. So, you had to have your shadowing done, your proportions done, all of the pieces and the parts all had to be right and executed well. And then the third drawing is a cross-section of that museum, and this helps to communicate whether or not you understood the vertical arrangement of how a building is put together. And as we know, he graduated, so these drawings must have been successful for him. Well, within a broad space of time, you would say 5 minutes after he graduated, he got married. And this is his wife, Catherine. In 1910, they got married and they left for Europe for their honeymoon. And then the middle picture is in the 20s, and the picture to the far right is in the 40s. They got married and they died together. Reginald Johnson was an enormous horseman, loved horses. There are many of his projects that have stables designed as part of the project. Kate School is one of them, interestingly enough. Their stable wasn't designed to hold horses, it was designed to hold a gym and other support pieces to a gym, but it's a stable nonetheless. He did the Flintwood riding stables, the Hope Ranch riding stables. And of course, he did riding stables for a private estate in Montecito, part of Rancho San Carlos. This is his wife on the far left, his son Joseph, and daughter Edith in the middle, and then Reginald Johnson with the hat on. And then you see him doing a couple of jumps. Of course, of the three passions of his life, horses, family, and architecture, here's a number of shots with his kids and his wife and his son on the wall there at their house in Carmel. Unfortunately, I don't know who the dog is. I don't know the dog's name. But you can see that he was a devoted father. And then we come to his office. So running an architectural practice in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, probably even up until roughly maybe even the 60s, there were no computers. Everything was drawn by hand. And in his day, he might have a staff, one architect might have a staff of 30 or 40 people. A couple of secretaries to take care of the paperwork, but an army of drafters and tracers and people who drew details. And because there was no, and this is very, very early, there was no blueprinting technology in many of these years. There was an army of people called tracers. So the drawings would get drawn once, and then to make copies, there would be tracers who would trace those drawings to make copies for others to be sent out to the field for construction. The most publicized photograph of Reginald Johnson is the one here where he's sitting at his desk. He opened his office a year after he, let's put it this way, he graduated MIT summer of 1910. He got married, went on his honeymoon, came back in the middle of 1911. They were gone about 10 months. Came back because they were going to have a baby. And of course, they wanted to have the baby on US soil. So they came back. And then he sat for his exams, became a licensed architect in December of 1911 and opened his office January 1912. He was in private practice from 1912 to 1920, went into a partnership with Gordon Kaufman and Roland Coate for 3 years. And that dissolved after about 3 years, and he went back into private practice from 1925 to 1947, where he stopped working. So the partnership with Kaufman and Coate was more a paper partnership. They were hoping by pooling their efforts, the three of them, that they could get larger commissions. And that never really did pan out, which is why the partnership was only not quite 3 years. Each architect worked independently during this partnership, and once they couldn't get those larger ones, they went their own way. Kaufman and Coate, interestingly enough, had worked for Reginald Johnson a few years before, so they were all very well familiar with one another. So again, this is kind of like that timeline. It's not meant for you to be able to read the whole thing, but basically to chase down what projects an architect executed. We do the same thing with the projects as we did with his life, and that is you start with the date he started his practice and you end with the date that he stopped working, and then you fill in all of the blanks in between. This is probably the most comprehensive list of projects that Reginald Johnson did. And this list represents buildings that still exist. You can go see these buildings, unless they're behind a big hedge or something like that, then obviously you can't, but you can still see many of these buildings, and we'll take a Google flight in a minute so that you can see a few of them. I enlarged the section in the middle just to kind of give you an idea of what was going on in 1919. You can see here that he was working on the original estate that now makes up Lotus Land, the original main house, front gate, garage, and outbuildings that the public does not see. They're behind in the upper part of the property were all done and designed by Reginald Johnson. And then they were remodeled. I refer to it as giving a building a facade-omy by George Washington Smith. And then you can see a few other ones here. So each one of these major houses, could take, 6, 8, 9, 12 months to design, to draw, and detail. And you can kind of get a sense that, if you've got 10 people working on one project, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 major houses. That's like 60 people you've got to have to get all this work done. And then there are a couple of additions. In his early career, he picked up, like most architects, he picked up whatever work he could get. Additions to a house or remodel of something. But within about 3 years of starting his practice, he stopped doing that. He was only focused on houses for very wealthy people. So again, this is not meant for you to be able to pick the street out. It just gives you a sense of the Pasadena and Los Angeles area over a 30-year period of time, the concentration of projects. They're all with these little blue dots. And primarily, most of them are in the Pasadena area, which is this next slide. There are 96 houses within, maybe a 3 or 4 mile radius. And just a very few commercial buildings. He didn't do much commercial at all. His forte really was private, high-end residential work. So we're going to take a jump off of here and go to Google Earth. And let me know if you can see Google Earth. So,
See the same map, yeah.
Yeah, so you should be able to see the map of the United States. Pardon me?
We are not seeing it.
Okay, hold on a second. Let me share that screen. All right, you should see it now.
Yeah, now we see it, yeah.
All right, so this is Google Earth. And after having a list of all of those projects that still exist, I just simply map their address onto Google Earth, and it allows you to zoom in and go see one. So there's one down here. We'll do one down here on Fire Island, Fisher Island. Now, if you know much about Fisher's Island, this island was controlled by the mega wealthy. You couldn't get on this island unless your net worth was above a certain amount. And it's not that way today, but it was when it started. And that's when Reginald Johnson did this house for Vanderpool. There's also, ironically, a George Washington Smith house on this island done about the same time. So, so this building, and we'll get on in there. This building is a typical kind of a Cape Cod looking building. What makes Reginald Johnson a master, in my opinion, is his ability to execute any style that he put his pencil to paper to design. Off to the left here, you see I've mapped all of them. So all we have to do is click on one and we'll go there. And one I want to point out, which is very interesting, is he did a observatory for a doctor who helped establish Caltech's studies. And when he retired, he knew that he wouldn't have access to the Caltech equipment anymore. And so he had, here it is, he had Reginald Johnson design him one for his backyard. And it's in Pasadena. So here we are, we're flying into Pasadena. And here we are. This is the Hale Observatory, which is in the backyard of this man's house. I think the property is now owned by Caltech. As you know, or might know, a telescope needs an incredible length of area for the mirrors to all work right. Well, you couldn't put a 150-foot tall building in a residential neighborhood. It just wouldn't fly. So what happens in this little building, you can see the top on it would slide open for the telescope. It's a building that's roughly about the height of a 2-story house. The rest of it is in the ground. Some 100 feet down is the rest of the telescope mirror mechanism that makes this thing work. And how Reginald Johnson got the project is that Reginald Johnson lived right next door, lived right here. So, you know, these are all very interesting things to fly to. Let's go to one that's in Montecito because we can. Or actually, let's go to one that we all really know and would like to get into. And that's this one, the Clark Estate. And interestingly enough, your last talk was about the property next door, and he did a mausoleum in the cemetery next door. It's right here on the edge. So, you know, those are all some very interesting projects. But let's get back to here. All right, so that's Pasadena. This is Santa Barbara, just a spotty map with blue dots on it to give you a sense of how many projects he did in the Santa Barbara area over a 20-year period of time, from Hope Ranch to Carpinteria. Most drawings, as I said, all drawings were done by hand. Nothing is by CAD. In almost every project that he designed, he worked with Ralph Stevens as the landscape architect. So in this particular house in Santa Barbara, the drawing on the left is the Ralph Stevens landscape drawing, and the drawing on the right is Reginald Johnson's drawing of the house. I believe this house is currently on the market and for sale. We're getting close to the end, so bear with me. During his time, Reginald Johnson's work was very well published. It had to do with two things. One, the copyright laws before 1978 established that your copyright could be protected from the date you publish something. So oftentimes architects would work to get their projects published in a magazine so that they could trigger automatic copyright. I think in those days it was 28 years initial term, and you could extend it for another 28 years. But now all that's changed since 1978. The April 1929 issue of the Architect and Engineer was devoted entirely to Reginald Johnson. Quite a few projects of his were in this particular issue. So I mentioned, in my opinion, what makes Reginald Johnson a master is that he had a very sharp grasp on various architectural languages, the language that makes a style, and he did them very well. If you asked him to design a Beaux-Arts building, he's got that. He helped to define what we call Spanish colonial revival. He was a master at the federal style, French Normandy, international, and Pueblo styles. And he believed that architecture should be regional. And with very few exceptions, you wouldn't find a Spanish colonial revival building in, let's say, Little Rock, Arkansas. You would find a building that fits that region. And like I say, there were a few exceptions because he did a couple of Spanish colonial revival buildings in the Midwest, but they're anomalies. He did a Pueblo building in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and it looks just like it came out of, an Indian village. So he was a master at this. This is the Biltmore. This was an extremely unique opportunity. The area where the Biltmore is located was essentially undeveloped when this project was being contemplated. And it was being promoted by a development company that was kind of trying to break into the hotel business. They did have some experience, but they weren't Hyatt. And so they were able to retain Reginald Johnson, and they asked for a building that was fitting for the area. And of course, Spanish colonial revival is what we do here. And so he did the main building, and then a year later did all of the cottages that are behind the main building. Here he's receiving an AIA gold medal presented to him by President Hoover in Washington, D.C. During the AIA convention of this year. And the funny thing to note here is that gold medals were given for design categories, commercial building, houses, residential, small residential, whatever the category was. You got a gold medal if you won that category. AIA does not do this anymore. The gold medal is reserved for one of the highest awards given to an individual. And so while it's a gold medal, it's not, quote, the gold medal, unquote. A very unique opportunity to have the President of the United States actually present this kind of an award to an individual. So here we are. It's approaching 1934, 33, 34. We're still pretty much in the throes of the Depression. Reginald Johnson, it was a smoker, by the way, you can tell here. He's just fed up with the whole mess. He kind of semi-retires. Architects really don't retire, but they kind of semi-retire. They just slow down their work. he did an about face. After the Clark estate, he no longer was interested in designing houses for rich people. He did quite well for himself designing houses for wealthy people. Traveled the world because of it. But he was a little fed up with that. And I'm sure that it was because of what was going on in the country as we were recovering from the Great Depression that drove some of these things in him. The plight of, the disadvantaged and underserved population, the crisis of housing and housing affordability, which is, an issue that just can't seem to get solved in any decade at all. And he completely abandoned all of those notions about Spanish colonial revival, French Normandy, any of those. He just tossed them all out the window and went totally for contemporary design. This could have been influenced by his son, who became an architect and did quite well, but was contemporary motivated in his design work. And since they lived on the same property, they had, ample opportunity to talk about this stuff. So he turns his attention to public housing. He does 3 major public housing projects in the late 30s and early 40s. He reluctantly takes on designing the Santa Barbara Post Office, a very rare and odd thing to have an architect selected outside of the federal process. Normally, it's a federal architect that does federal buildings. In this case, he was selected through the pressure of local Santa Barbara folks. And then at some point in the middle 40s, he just decides that he is done with everything and he no longer needs to keep any of his professional or personal papers, and he puts them in the backyard and sets fire to them. And of course, this is something a trick that he picked up from his father. When they were in Detroit, his father was interviewed for the local paper, and the reporter asked his father, so you seem to have a shelf of a bunch of past sermons. Do you keep all of your sermons? And the father said, no, ever so often I, haul them outside, put them in a bin and set fire to them because, I don't need them anymore. So Reginald Johnson did the same thing. And so that's why there are very few records, hardly any drawings that you can go see, and no personal papers like letters or contracts or any of that stuff to research. So it's very sparse, very slim pickings in that regard. So he dies, age 70. He was done, and that's it. And we're trying, almost 70 years after his death, we're still trying to figure him out. So all of this effort is leading, hopefully, to a monograph that I'm currently working on. There's some mild interest from Rizzoli International. They haven't said no. They haven't said yes, but they haven't said no either. So we're just, we're researching. It takes us, I suppose, about 2 years to get through the whole thing. Collecting drawings, verifying facts. We've connected up with the family. The 5 grandchildren are very helpful in sharing stories about the family and photographs and family histories that are very enlightening. And we're getting, I would say, of all of the owners that represent the buildings that will be in the monograph, we're getting pretty good cooperation from just about all of them. There, I think, is what we know about Reginald Johnson. you know probably now as much about Reginald Johnson as anybody knows about Reginald Johnson. And with that, I'll entertain questions from anyone. And I suppose I don't know how you.
Robert, yeah,
I don't know how you unmute everybody, but
Yeah, just unmute yourself, everybody, when you kind of
Yeah.
ask a question. You can unmute yourself.
I just wondered, Robert, did he always live in Pasadena? He never lived here in Santa Barbara?
he never lived in Santa Barbara.
Huh.
They've always lived in Pasadena. They had, as far as I can tell, they lived in at least 5 different houses. They had a ranch, a horse ranch in Carmel. I still haven't located that. I've got a deed, but not a parcel number. And so once I track that down, then we'll know that. But no, and never lived in Santa Barbara, but stayed here often.
Robert, did you mention that he and his wife died together? Was it simultaneously, so to speak?
No, what I suppose what I meant, that was slightly misleading, so I apologize. They didn't die on the same day. She lived 20 years after he did, but they were only married once. They married and they stayed together, and he passed, and she stayed in their house for another 20 years.
Are there
Robert,
any, are there any descendants? I'm sorry.
I thought you through. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Are there any descendants of Reginald Johnson in the Santa Barbara area?
Not that I have been able to find. One of his children lived in Ventura at one point in her life, but I don't think that they live there now.
Robert, where were
Become an
the housing
architect?
projects?
Marie?
Where were the housing projects?